Anarchy, revolution, terrorism, and a lot of traveling around and getting arrested. Sometimes the story focuses around the life of a henchman, such as a pair of immigrants who were involved in a bankroll robbery that went bad. Other times, it may include encouraging strikes that just so happen to turn violent. Sometimes still, it's about leading an entire network of activists who bomb and poison those who are part of a system that we are all supposed to hate. No, I'm not talking about Morpheus from the Matrix. Today, we'll take a look at the Italian anarchist Luigi Galleani in this episode of The Villains Do. This is The Villains Do, where we take a critical look at villains throughout history to see if they were misjudged, slandered, or truly monstrous. My name is Redjoy, and today we're going to be looking at the life of Luigi Galleani. Luigi Galleani was born in 1861 in Piedmont in the recently unified Kingdom of Italy. The 19th century was an era where industrialized policies were facing great advancement for society, but also strong criticism, as well as changes to labor and organization of workers. The goal of many of these organizations was to challenge the status quo of the theory of capitalism combined with the de facto enforcement of the governments to quell strikes. Thus, to activists at the time, many of them subscribed to a combination of the rejection of the state or anarchism, as well as a resistance to private property and capitalism or socialism. Galleani became a torchbearer for the anarchist communist movement, and his endorsement of political assassinations and terror tactics, what he called the propaganda of the deed, would have a dark future and came from a quasi-medieval past. More on that later. When he was young, Galleani studied law at the University of Turin, which gave way to political activism. Like many revolutionaries from this time period, Galleani didn't come from a poor working-class home, but rather came from a middle-class family which allowed him to access higher education opportunities. His skills with speaking and writing led him to be heavily involved with the Italian anarchist movement, which had interesting relationships with other leftist groups, such as the Italian Workers' Party and the Italian Socialist Party. And by interesting, I mean that all of these groups kind of hated each other. Through many years of writing and advocating for violent revolution against the system, as well as many arrests that haunted him, Galleani would eventually be exiled for one event in 1898, the Baba Beccaris massacre in Milan, resulting in several hundred casualties. First, Galleani would be exiled to Sicily, and then to Egypt, and then he would make his way to the United States. While in exile, Galleani would meet his wife, Maria Rallo, and they would get married. These two would have 4 children together, as well as one son from Maria's previous relationship. Well, that's very nice. Galleani would arrive in the United States in 1901, settling in New Jersey. His timing was interesting, since this was only months after the assassination of President McKinley from Leon Czolgosz, a fellow anarchist, and there was a massive backlash towards anarchism. Since Galleani arrived, he came to Paterson, New Jersey, which is a hotspot for Italian laborers. There, he published the anarchist newspaper Cronaca Sovversiva, or the Subversive Chronicle, so I don't have to try repeating it again and again in Italian and messing up the pronunciation. He was a publisher from 1903 to 1918, which became, arguably, the most influential anarchist periodical in North America, and it allowed for his ideas to spread worldwide. In these writings, Galleani promoted direct action, sabotage, and the revolutionary use of violence against systems that were capitalist or that promoted the state, or even promoted social reform. You see, in the eyes of the anarchists, they saw reform as a slow tool of the bourgeoisie as a form of compromise, so they didn't really like it that much. During this time, he supported strikes such as the 1902 Paterson Silk Strike, resulting in him getting shot in the face. Don't worry, he lived by escaping to Canada. Later, he would write La Salute et le Voix, or The Health is in You, again, apologies for the mispronunciation. A pamphlet that espoused his ideas in giving the formula for nitroglycerin. Now, I'm a big fan of promoting education and encouraging freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. But something tells me that this might be a little bit of an issue. With this pamphlet serving as a bomb-making manual, Galleani explicitly encouraged insurrection through acts of terror. While Galleani wasn't keeping his location well known, he was angering a lot of people, especially fellow leftists who were getting annoyed with being associated with terrorism and murder. In 1906, a rival socialist newspaper just so happened to drop in information about where Galleani had returned to the United States after getting shot in the face. It turns out it was Vermont, which I hear is just lovely, like all the time. Anyway, he was arrested and stood trial for his involvement in inciting a riot, but he was released with a hung jury. He returned to Vermont, of course, and continued being as loud as possible. He gave speeches and he continued writing articles for his periodical, just hoping to kill as many people as possible. You know, for the future. His followers, known as the Galleanisti, rejected any formal organization and just liked the killing, and they liked blowing up stuff. And it resulted in many assassinations, robberies, bombings, and eventually the 1920 Wall Street bombing that killed 38 people and injured several hundred other people. For context, the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing killed 3 people from the bombing itself, injured 281 people, and resulted in 3 more deaths in the manhunt afterwards. Every death is a tragedy, but to extremists, their views have more weight than human lives. Among his followers were Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who were poor, innocent immigrant robbers who shot and killed 2 people in an armed robbery in 1920. These 2 had a contradictory, bigoted, and poorly run trial and were found guilty and were killed by the state. These 2, for their deeds, weren't actually killed because the state had enough evidence for the crimes they committed, but they were killed based on the reputation of the Galleanisti, anarchism in general, and a big smattering of anti-Italian racism. Later on, progressive American politicians would condemn the way that the trial was run, which is more than fair to condemn, but even they didn't call for or pursue a pardon for their crime, almost as if to say that they accepted the result of the trial, but not the motive for the result. So for all of the bombings, the killings, the brutality, the innocent people being slaughtered on the altar of revolutionary anarchism, it was the most understandable stance that Galleani had that would get him into trouble, opposing war. Strange, right? I mean, you'd think for a guy who absolutely loved murder and death that his opposition to World War I was a bit off. Well, it did make sense in his world, since this was a war that wasn't meant to bring about the necessary social change to overthrow the world order, but rather it was a matter of great power politics, of emperors pushing around legions of cohorts and conscripts on maps to gain new provinces and titles. He wasn't wrong per se, at least not in this opinion, but the end result would, coincidentally, be one of the most revolutionary wars in human history, ending the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, and causing many aspects of crisis in the British, Japanese, French, and Chinese empires. With his anti-war stance, he encouraged his followers to resist the draft, go into hiding, or flee the country. Some fled to Mexico, where they may have wanted to start an anarchist revolution, but A, Mexico was already dealing with a revolution at the time, and B, Galleani felt that the Mexican race was, quote, uninterested in things like, quote, anarchy and, quote, social change, even though I just got done saying that they were fighting a revolution at this time. With this stance, saying bad things about the government and their war, federal authorities now considered Galleani a threat. Not the blowing up people or the casual racism towards Mexicans, but rather challenging the U.S. blowing up Germans. In 1917, the offices of his newspaper were raided by federal agents and he was arrested. In 1919, he was charged with conspiracy and was deported along with 8 of his followers under the Anarchist Exclusion Act. Now, while I don't love the violence and the bloodthirsty craving of people being killed for anarchist communism, I also don't love the government's overreach during the Wilson administration. Back in Italy, he continued to print his newspaper, as well as works that condemned moderates as being weak and too dependent on the democratic process. In 1922, he came across a new bloodthirsty ideology, fascism. It turns out that these two were made for each other. Just kidding. Galleani was arrested by Mussolini's fascist regime for 14 months. After his time in prison, he wrote what would be considered to be the key text of anarchist communist thought, The End of Anarchism? Note the phrasing there, it ends with a question mark. You couldn't get across. I'll put it up on the screen. In the book, he condemns Francesco Saviero Merlino, an Italian socialist lawyer who had been critical of anarchism. Galleani called out the authoritarian goals of socialism, collectivists, and communists as just wanting to, quote, posit a coercive power that contains and appeases their inequities, or, at least, an administration state which rules and regulates production, distribution, and consumption, while anarchism rejects any authority and proclaims that the individual is ungovernable and promotes self-government through the dismantling of capitalist and government systems. Galleani rejected that his era would see the end of anarchism just due to being driven underground in favor of reformism and social change, that they can keep up with the bombings and the killings. Well, the fascists liked using assassinations and bombings just like the anarchists, but they really didn't like the book very much, and they arrested Galleani again in 1926. Galleani was moved around and later released under surveillance. While walking near his new exiled home, he collapsed and died of a heart attack on November 4th, 1931. He was aged 70. In looking at Luigi Galleani critically, if I told you about a leader who organized people to meet, protest, boycott, speak out, strike, and vote in a particular manner, you might say that that person's ideas or their partisan politics may or may not be good, but it'd be hard to say that their actions alone made them a villain. However, it's that next step that causes us to see evil. The death threats, the bombings, the poisonings, the shootings, the stabbings, all for a political cause. This takes us not only out of a moral good, but also takes us away from the modern political process. Think of those individuals who urge their followers to kill those who oppose their views for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they worship the wrong kind of religion, like crusaders and jihadists who slaughter those who are living their lives just to facilitate a change towards their way of thinking. What's the difference between the anarchists who actively murdered and slaughtered through bombings and killings to do away with the state and an economic system that was intertwined with that state, and the Knights of the First Crusade, who waded through bloody streets of Antioch and Jerusalem to overthrow the Muslim emirs and establish Christian rule over the Middle East? Okay, so one is using bombs and guns while the other uses lances and crossbows, but the effect is the same. As I said earlier, to extremists, their views have more weight than human lives. Some might say that the difference could be that what the anarchists like Galleani were fighting for, to an end to oppression and cruelty, to make the world free for everyone. That's when we get into the debate. Is this actually freedom? An anarchist might say yes, since the oppression comes from the state as well as from the capitalists and collectivists. However, if you ask a capitalist, they'd say no, since anarchism gives no protection for personal property and individual liberties that allow us to innovate and create new products and artwork for consumption, profit, and progress. If you ask a socialist, they'd also say no, since anarchism provides no protection for the individual against the predations of the strong over the weak, and no real freedom of wants and needs of our survival. Finally, if you ask the crusader or the jihadist, they'd also say no, since freedom comes through God and oppression comes through the sins of mankind and the works of the devil. taking the individual viewpoints and of intellectual theory into account can explain a reason for calling for violence, but it doesn't excuse it. Luigi Galleani wasn't just a political thinker or a political extremist. Someone can be those things and avoid being a complete villain. I would say that the 1960s had violence, but there were also many politicians like J. William Fulbright or Barry Goldwater, or activists like Martin Luther King Jr., all of whom had different beliefs, and they didn't waver from those beliefs, but they also resisted the call to violence. Luigi Galleani didn't just push for his ideas, he also wanted people dead. The propaganda of the deed is the step into evil, and Galleani walked right into it. So I wrote this script at the end of 2025, and it seems like we're going backwards down the rabbit hole of espousing political violence as an acceptable way to deal with political opponents. I really wish I could say that this was just reserved for political nuts, and that calling this out could be considered nut-picking, or choosing the worst examples as the primary example. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. For example, the state of Virginia just elected a man to serve as the chief law enforcement agent who joked about putting 2 bullets through the head of his political opponent and wished for his opponent's families to be killed so that they would make political changes that he desired. We also have a president who urged his followers to violently hit someone in the face for throwing a tomato, or to violently march on Congress to get his way. We have had political assassinations, both successes and failed attempts. Thankfully, most rational voices have condemned the violence, but the voices of madness celebrating the propaganda of the deed seem to be growing louder and louder. Excuses are being presented, quote, that guy said bad things first, or, quote, that guy is evil and they deserve to die. All of those lead to a path away from democracy and modernity, and to a darker medieval past that preached that the infidel must die. For the third time, to extremists, their views have more weight than human lives. Perhaps Galleani would be pleased, but I think that Pope Urban, Timothy McVeigh, and Osama bin Laden would be pleased as well. I pray that their influence does not grow, but I don't think my prayers are going to be answered anytime soon.